Close your eyes. Now open them. You're no longer in the present. You're standing in America 300,000 years ago. The air smells different, heavy, untouched. Around you, strange creatures roam freely. Lions the size of horses, elephants with curved tusks longer than your body, and humans, but not quite like us. This isn't a scene from a sci-fi movie. This is real. This is Earth, and it looks nothing like the world you know. Welcome to Info Twist Zone. Back then, Earth wasn't ruled by cities or civilizations. It was ruled by chaos, by climate, by creatures, and by countless species of humans. That's right, there wasn't just one kind of human. At least 7 distinct types walked the land at the same time, including Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo naledi, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo floresiensis, and others we've barely begun to discover. Each had different faces, body shapes, and brain sizes. Some were muscular and built for cold. Others were small, nimble, and suited for heat. Some carved tools from flint and bone. Others painted on cave walls. They didn't all speak the same language, but they all knew fear, hunger, and the fight to survive. The world itself looked like something out of a dream. The Sahara wasn't a desert. It was a green paradise, full of lakes, trees, and herds of massive animals. Europe was blanketed in thick forests, with giant elk and woolly rhinos crashing through the undergrowth. Even the skies were different, wilder, untouched, filled with birds and storms. And there you are, a single early human, standing in the middle of it all. No weapons, no GPS, no idea what tomorrow might bring. Your breath clouds in the cold morning air. You clutch a sharpened rock, listening for the sound of something creeping behind you. This isn't just the past. It's the prologue to everything. Because in this brutal, beautiful chaos, the foundations of modern humanity were born. The instincts, emotions, and creativity that define us today were forged under volcanoes, across rivers, inside caves. So take a deep breath, step away from the present, because to understand how we came to be, we must go back, not hundreds, not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of years. This is Earth 300,000 years ago. As we step deeper into prehistory, one fact becomes clear. We were never alone. At a single watering hole, you could witness evolution's diversity side by side. A stocky Neanderthal drinks downstream, heavy-browed, broad-shouldered, breathing through a wide nose built for frigid climates. Just across the bank, a group of Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors, quietly crouch in the tall grass, watching, calculating, planning. But these weren't the only players in humanity's origin story. There were Denisovans, a mysterious group who left barely any bones behind, only traces of DNA scattered in modern populations. Homo heidelbergensis, possibly the bridge between the early and the modern. And Homo naledi, who buried their dead in underground chambers long before we thought that behavior existed. Further east, on isolated islands, Homo florenziensis, the hobbits of Indonesia, no taller than a 5-year-old child, hunted many elephants with spears. Each of these human types shared a planet. Sometimes they met. Sometimes they mated. Sometimes they killed each other. But what connected them wasn't conflict. It was the shared struggle to endure a world that refused to be tamed. Climate shifted wildly. In some places, grasslands turned into jungle within a few centuries. In others, rainfall vanished and forests crumbled into desert. Volcanoes erupted, blotting out the sun. Meteorites scarred the land. And through it all, humans adapted. Fire was sacred. It meant survival. Tribes carried embers in hollow horns, passed down from flame to flame. Tools became more than weapons. They were memory. A sharpened stone wasn't just sharp. It told a story. Of the place it was found, of the hand that shaped it, of the prey it pierced. Soft awe. Archaic shelters were carved into cliffs. Caves became more than protection. They became canvases. The earliest known art, spirals, handprints, animals, weren't drawn for decoration. They were declarations. We were here. We endured.
And amidst the chaos of a planet in flux, something remarkable happened. These scattered bands of humans from every edge of the globe began to leave marks that would outlast them. Footprints, tools, DNA, fire. They didn't know they were writing history, but they were. This is the age of many humans, and the beginning of one species' rise. The Earth 300,000 years ago was not peaceful. It was wild and unpredictable. One day, a valley might teem with green life, rivers full, trees tall, animals grazing under a warm sun. Then, something shifted. A tilt in the Earth's axis, a change in ocean currents. Suddenly, rains stop. The grass browns, water holes dry up, and the animals move on. But humans couldn't move fast enough, so they adapted. Those who lived in the northern regions faced cold that turned breath into crystals. They learned to make layered clothing from furs, to trap heat with fire pits dug into the ground, to insulate their shelters with moss and bone. In these frozen places, humans evolved broader noses, shorter limbs, conserving warmth like walking furnaces. In the equatorial forests, where danger lurked in every shadow, survival was a different game. Tribes became quiet, precise, able to melt into the green. They learned which plants healed and which ones killed. They moved silently. They hunted with patience. They read every sound in the wind. But perhaps the greatest teacher of all was time. Because as the climate swung between ice and fire, only those who changed endured. And with every adaptation, we became less like our cousins and more like us.
Brains grew larger. Social bonds deepened. Language evolved, not in spoken words at first, but in gestures, symbols, shared rituals. When a child was born, the whole tribe knew the meaning. When someone died, they mourned with silence, with paint, with buried artifacts. Fire was no longer just for cooking. It became storytelling. At night, elders pointed to the stars and told tales of beasts and gods. They warned of droughts. They remembered floods. These stories weren't fantasy, they were survival maps passed across generations. And in every fire circle, another spark ignited. Curiosity. Slowly, space between lines. Why do the stars move? Where does the sun go? Why are we here? These early questions would echo through time, shaping the minds that would someday build pyramids, write philosophies, and reach for the moon. But none of that was possible until our ancestors learned to live with a planet that was never still. The Earth didn't wait for us. We chased it. And in doing so, we changed forever. At first, humans were just survivors, scattered, scared, and silent. But then, they formed tribes, not out of strategy, out of necessity. Alone, you were prey. Together, you had a chance. In the shadows of ancient cliffs, small bands gathered. 10 people, 15, rarely more than a few dozen. They shared food. They watched each other's children. They mourned the dead. And around fire, they became something more than animals. The flicker of flame wasn't just warmth, it was magic. It kept predators away. It cooked food. But more than that, it created space to think, time to dream. At night, someone would stare into the dancing firelight and draw a line in the dirt, a symbol, a pattern, a memory. Another would take a stick and scratch the same shape onto the cave wall. And slowly, humans began to tell stories. No written words yet, just marks, rhythms, paint, grunts that turned into chants, chants that turned into meaning. From this, belief was born. The sun became a god, the moon a guide. The cave lion's tooth was no longer just a trophy, it was a protector, worn on a string around the neck. Rain wasn't just water, it was a gift or a warning. The world was no longer just a place to live, it was something to understand. And as these early humans wrapped themselves in fur and huddled for warmth, their minds lit up like the fire they fed. They made tools, spears, nets, hooks carved from bone. They found ways to work together. One to hunt, one to track, one to prepare the meat, one to care for the children. Every member had a role. Every life had value. Even the elders, too old to hunt, were the keepers of memory, the ones who knew where water hid in dry seasons, where the herds passed each year, where danger slept. And when storms raged outside, when the sky cracked with lightning and the earth trembled, they'd gather close and listen to the stories. Because stories weren't just entertainment. They were the first libraries. They were the glue. And without them, humanity would have frozen in the dark. But with them, we began to rise. The hunt wasn't sport. It wasn't glory. It was survival. Every step outside the cave was a gamble with death. A wrong move meant starvation, or worse, being hunted yourself. But early humans learned, slowly, brutally. They studied tracks in the mud. They watched birds fly suddenly, a signal that something stirred below. They listened to the wind like a whisper from the earth itself. At first, they scavenged, waiting for predators to finish, sneaking in for scraps. Then they learned to drive animals over cliffs. They shaped stone tips, fire-hardened spears. They moved in groups, silent, coordinated, deadly. The mammoth was no longer invincible. The aurochs, those wild prehistoric bulls, became meat, bone, and hide. One successful hunt could feed a tribe for weeks, but the cost was steep. Legs broken in stampedes, faces torn by tusks, sons lost in the snow. Every meal came with sacrifice, and from that came respect. They carved animals into stone, painted them in ochre and charcoal on cavern walls, not to boast, but to remember, to honor, to ask forgiveness. It wasn't just hunting, it was a relationship. Kill only what you need, use every piece, waste nothing. That belief echoed through generations. Hunters wore skins that still smelled of wild grass. Their fingers were thick with calluses from the spear. They moved like animals, crouched, silent, alert. Women tracked too. Children learned early how to find grubs, how to tell fresh droppings from old, how to throw a stone just right. Everyone contributed. Because in this world, you either fed the fire or you faded into it. Still, moments of peace existed. After a successful hunt, laughter echoed through valleys. Bones cracked open from marrow. Stories flowed, some true, some stretched, all sacred. And when the meat was roasted, when the bellies were full, they looked up at the stars, wondering if the gods were watching, or if the gods were just them, reflected in firelight. The hunt fed more than stomachs. It fed tradition, bond, identity. And as the tribes grew bolder, so did their reach. Across mountains, rivers, ice, chasing survival, chasing the future. They didn't invent fire,
They inherited it.
A lightning strike, a tree aflame, a beast charred in the blaze. At first, fire was fear, a destroyer, untouchable. But then, a gift. They learned to carry it in hollowed bones, in smoldering logs. They fed it moss and dried grass. They learned to whisper to it, nurture it. Soon fire lived with them, not just around them. Inside caves, it pushed the dark away. Outside, it held back the wolves. It warmed the old, dried the soaked, lit up the face of the mother holding her child. It cooked the meat, softened the roots, made bone brittle enough to sharpen. It became more than heat. It became memory. Around fire, they told stories, not just of the hunt, but of the stars, the ones that didn't come back, the ancestors who once crossed the river and never returned. They etched those stories into walls, not with words, but with symbols. Mammoths, suns, spirals. Painted in red ochre and soot, they were more than decoration. They were warnings, lessons, identity. They didn't write history, they lived it in flickers of flame and shadow. And fire changed them. It extended the night, stretched the day. It gathered people closer, a circle of faces glowing orange, eyes reflecting dreams. Children learned not just how to strike flint, but when to use it. Elders became keepers of flame, literal and metaphorical. They knew where the dry moss grew. They knew the sound of wet wood before it hissed. Fire connected generations, a symbol of survival, a weapon, a teacher. And yet, it was fragile. A single gust, a forgotten ember, and warmth turned to death. So they protected it like life itself, because it was life. And in that glowing orange dance, under smoke-stained ceilings, something began to form, not just survival, but culture. Fire wasn't just a tool, it was the first mirror. In its light, humans saw themselves not as beasts, but as something else, something becoming. And from that light, civilization began to spark. The fire gave light, but beyond its glow, shadows hunted. To live 300,000 years ago meant constant alertness. Every rustle might be a stalker. Every stillness could hide death. This was the age of monsters. Lions, twice the size of today's kings, prowled the open plains. Saber-toothed cats crouched in silence, waiting for the one who strayed too far. Packs of giant hyenas with jaws that could crush bone circled camps at night, laughing in the dark. Humans, they weren't top predators. They were prey. They didn't run faster. Their claws were soft. Their teeth weren't built for tearing. So they adapted. Fear became strategy. The night was dangerous, so they rose with the sun. Eyes adjusted not just to daylight, but to tracks, to the shift of birds in the sky, to broken twigs and blood trails. They watched the animals not just to hunt them, but to learn from them. They built their first weapons not to conquer, but to survive. Sharpened sticks, stone axes, bone knives, tools born of desperation, but perfected by generations. And they hunted, not alone, but together. A lone human couldn't bring down a mammoth. A dozen with spears, they could turn prey into a feast, and bones into tools.
They invented cooperation. They whispered during the stalk. They moved like wolves in formation. They sacrificed for the group because one death could mean the death of all. And when the hunt failed, they endured hunger, frost, loss. Mothers watched children die. Fathers returned empty-handed. They mourned, not with words, but with silence. A rock placed beside a sleeping body, a piece of fur tucked into cold hands. Even death taught them something, not to fear it, but to prepare for it. So they did. With each season, they grew smarter, not taller, not faster, smarter. Because intelligence, not strength, was the only way to survive a world designed to kill. And over time, predators became prey. Not because humans were stronger, but because they were together. And from that fragile unity came a force the world hadn't seen before. Not beast, not spirit, human. Somewhere in a dark cave, far from the growl of predators and the howl of wind, a hand reached out and left a mark. Red ochre, blown from a mouth, etched the outline of a human palm onto stone. It was the first "I was here," a silent scream across millennia. This was not survival. This was culture. It began with symbols, handprints, spirals, animals dancing across cave walls, stories told in flickers of firelight. They weren't just decoration, they were memory. A record of what was seen, feared, hunted, loved. From memory came meaning. Some groups began to bury their dead, not just leave them, but honor them with stones, pigments, even tools placed beside lifeless bodies. Was it grief? Was it hope? No one knows. But something had changed. They sang, simple chants, rhythms echoed in caves, perhaps to scare beasts or to soothe children. Music was born not from joy, but from the need to feel less alone. And language, it started not with words, but with shared glances, gestures, calls that meant danger, here, together. Slowly, those calls became sounds. Sounds became words. Words became bonds. A mother humming a tune while preparing meat. A father miming a hunt, children wide-eyed around the fire. This was no longer just a species trying to survive. This was the birth of belonging. They shared more than food, they shared meaning. The cave became not just shelter, but home. Fire became not just warmth, but ritual.
Bones became not just tools, but art. Even time began to shift. They started noticing the stars, counting seasons, watching the moon wax and fade like a silent drumbeat above the earth. And slowly, the mind expanded, from immediate need to imagined futures, from pain to prayer. And from that prayer came something eternal. Not strength, not speed, but story. And we are still telling it.
The world outside the cave was merciless, full of hunger, injury, and cold that could crack bones. And so, humans turned inward. They lit fires, not just for heat, but for hope. A fire was more than survival. It was a center, a heart. Around it, fears melted and thoughts were spoken aloud. Here, ideas were born. That the stars might be watching, that the wind might carry voices, that the dead might not be truly gone. Belief had entered the human mind, not as religion yet, but as wonder. What caused the rain? Why did death come? What moved the sun? Questions with no answers led to faith. Some groups buried their dead in fetal positions, as if preparing them for rebirth. Others smeared ochre on corpses, red, the color of blood, of life, as if trying to bring them back. Around these bodies were tools, flowers, carved bones, the first rituals. No gods yet, but awe. And in that awe, humanity found something deeper than instinct: imagination. Shamans emerged, those who dreamed, who danced, who claimed to speak with fire, bone, storm. Whether real or not, they offered answers where none existed. And answers gave comfort. They told stories of great beasts that became stars, of ancestors who whispered through wind, of spirits who watched from trees. These myths stitched together fear and survival. They gave meaning to pain, purpose to death, and a sense of order in chaos. This wasn't just the beginning of belief, it was the beginning of power. Those who controlled the story began to lead. Elders were respected not just for knowledge, but for memory. Shamans for their visions, warriors for their courage. A structure was forming, not by force, but by narrative. And within that structure, humanity's most powerful tool was forged: shared belief. It didn't matter if the stories were true. It mattered that people believed them together, because belief unites. And from that unity, civilization would one day rise. But for now, it was just firelight, just whispers, just hope dancing in the shadows of a cave. By now, humans had fire, tools, shelters, art, even belief. But something was still missing. The final piece of the puzzle. A spark. Not in the sky or in the soil, but in the brain. Somewhere along the line, a child was born who saw the world differently.
She noticed patterns in the stars. He remembered paths to water across seasons. She mimicked the sounds of birds and created the first song. They weren't stronger. They weren't faster, but their minds held something new, complex thought. And slowly, that spark caught fire. Groups began organizing around leaders, not just of strength, but of strategy. They planned hunts weeks in advance. They passed down knowledge, not just through action, but through spoken word. Language exploded. So did memory. So did culture. Now, fire wasn't just a tool, it was a tradition. Paintings weren't just marks, they were messages. Songs weren't just sounds, they were histories. And the earth, once a place of instinct and survival, became a canvas of meaning. From one group to the next, humans began to pass more than genetics. They passed stories, and stories built the future. Some groups died out: Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo naledi. But their blood runs in ours. Their lessons echo in our bones. Because it wasn't brute force that won. It was connection. It was memory. It was the ability to dream forward, to see a world not as it was, but as it could be. And that changed everything. The ice ages would come and go, forests would fall, empires would rise, but that spark, it never left. It lives in your voice, your hands, your choices, in the way you teach, in the way you love, in the way you remember. You are not just descended from survivors. You are made of them. This is not a tale of extinction. It's the greatest survival story ever told. The story of how 300,000 years ago, Earth was not ours, but we walked anyway. And in walking, we became something new. We became human. This is your story. This is our story. This was Earth 300,000 years ago. And you've been watching Info Twist Zone.